Hey, what's up? I'm Matt, and today we're going to be doing MIDI videos. It's going to be great. I love MIDI. Hey, I'm Matt. I'm with LANDR today, talking about my favorite subject, MIDI, and what it is and how we use it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. So today we're going to look at what is MIDI, and if you're wondering what it stands for, it actually stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and that's exactly what it does. It's an interface between all these musical instruments and a computer. Musical Instrument Digital Interface. So MIDI was invented in the early 1980s as a way to let different instruments communicate with each other. Before MIDI, all these different manufacturers had their own means of communicating with sequencers, but someone realized, hey, a lot of studios have a lot of different equipment. There must be a universal way to connect them. And what's amazing too is it allows it to communicate with computers. So we can use Ableton, Logic, Pro Tools to send information to these devices. So as you can see here, I have 3 different machines, all different manufacturers, but they all use MIDI to allow each other to talk, which is really, really helpful in the studio. So now you have an overview of what MIDI is. Let's take a little deeper look and see how I actually have this set up. So if you notice, anything with MIDI usually has 3 inputs. One is a MIDI out, the other is a MIDI in, and one's a MIDI through. What an out does, it sends a MIDI signal out of the device, a MIDI in takes a MIDI signal inside, and a MIDI through allows it to pass to another device if you want to chain them together. Think of guitar pedals having little jacks in between each other, chaining them together. That's what a MIDI through allows you to do. So if you look closely here, I have my Moog set up to control my bass line. So the MIDI out of the Moog is going into the MIDI in of the bass line, allowing me to take these keys and control this synthesizer. So now if you look, I'm affecting the pitch by playing the keys, and I'm adjusting the perimeters because this is actually what's generating the sound, not the Moog. The Moog is just allowing me to take the keys and control it. The way MIDI works on modern devices, they actually have 2 inputs. You have the USB to connect it, or you have the traditional MIDI ports, like the MIDI in, through, and out we just talked about. The Moog is a great example of a modern instrument that actually has both, and the TR-909 is an example of one that just has MIDI in and MIDI out. So if you want to set this up, the Moog is very simple. You plug a USB into your computer, and it will connect. Because the 909 is an older instrument, it doesn't have USB MIDI. It just has the traditional MIDI ports. So in that case, for me to connect it to Ableton, I need to actually get a MIDI USB box. Sometimes your sound card has a built-in MIDI in, MIDI out. You can use that. If not, you might get a box that you can hook up to Ableton, which allows it to send information to your devices that don't have USB. So now that I explained what is MIDI and how I have it set up, let's talk about how to get it working in your DAW. In my situation, I'm using Ableton, but it's the same for almost every DAW. So what I want to do is I'm going to click on the Live button and go to Preferences. You're going to see that there's a dedicated MIDI tab because everyone knows MIDI is so important and it has its own place in every software. So when I click on MIDI, you're going to see a couple of things. It looks a bit intense, but it's really simple. First thing you're going to notice is that you're going to have a bunch of inputs and outputs. Those inputs and outputs correspond to the MIDI ins and MIDI outs that we were talking about earlier. Now you're going to see track, sync, and remote. Now what those 3 things do is that track allows the actual notes to be changed between instruments, sync is going to allow instruments to be on the same BPM, and the remote is going to allow an instrument to control a different parameter. When you open this up, you're most likely going to see a bunch of these off, and you might see less or more inputs and outputs. See, in my situation, I'm using the Moog Sub-Phatty with a USB because it's modern, so it pops up as input Moog Sub-Phatty, output Moog Sub-Phatty. Now you're going to notice MIDI port A, B, and C. And this corresponds to my MIDI device. And you can see I have A, B, C, D, which are right there in Ableton. So we want the notes that I'm playing on the keys of the Sub-Phatty playing the notes on the bass line. So I got to turn this on as an input because this is inputting notes into Ableton. So if I turn this on, I should be able to get sounds, right? But you're going to hear nothing's being triggered. And that's because Ableton needs to know where these notes go. Where is it outputting it to? And that's where I'm going to choose the MIDI channel that corresponds to my bass line, which in my case, because I'm using a MIDI box, it's port A. So if I go to output MIDI port A and I turn it on, guess what? We got a sound because now MIDI is being sent from one device to another and Ableton is telling it, hey, this is where it's going. You might notice that why don't I just turn them all on? Well, you actually totally can. I just want to show it like this so you kind of see how to set it up. But what I do in my situation is I literally turn them all on because I don't want to think about where they're going in the setup, because we can do that later within the DAW, which I'm going to show you. So now that we set up the MIDI routing in Ableton, let's look at how we make a MIDI track in Ableton to actually program notes. So what you need to do is you got to go create, and you're going to see two options: insert audio track, which I'm sure everyone's used to using, and then we're going to have another one called insert MIDI track. So when I click on that, I'm going to get a blank MIDI thing, and you're going to see two options: MIDI from and MIDI to, which is exactly the equivalent to MIDI in and MIDI out. So what I'm going to do is that MIDI from, which is really convenient in Ableton, you don't got to select anything. You can have all ins, which means that anything that's sending a MIDI input signal is going to come through there. So if I click on the sub-fatty, you're going to see that it's lighting up. If I click on even my keyboard, it's going to light up, which is really, really cool and convenient. Now, if I want to send it to the bass line, all I got to do is go to MIDI to, and I got to choose MIDI Sport 4x4 Port A, like we did before, and now I'm going to be able to hear a note once I click the monitor in. Awesome. If I don't want to use the sub-fatty anymore to control the bass line, I actually want to control it directly from Ableton. In that MIDI channel we just created, I can just double click anywhere and I'll get this piano roll. As you can see, I have a loop here and I have corresponding keys. If I hit these keys, guess what? It's going to play the bass line. And what's really cool is I can actually draw in notes like this. If I change the monitor now to auto and I hit play, we're going to hear it on the bass line. So if you're really good at writing melodies, you can actually fill in all your melodies within Ableton. Or if you want some inspiration, like I always rely on, I like using the arpeggiator, which is built into Ableton under MIDI effects. So now, if I want to use an arpeggiator, let's just choose Housier Than Thou. I can click on it, and it's going to send an arpeggiated version of the notes I put in. I like clicking on hold. So what hold does, it allows the arpeggiator to kind of go on forever, so I can actually jam with the box. So if I click on hold and I play again, you get this whole arpeggiator now, and I can actually sit here and tweak. And what's really cool about that is I can sculpt my sound while it's going, and I can think of ideas and how I'm going to use the arpeggiator or what else I want to do now. And that's one of the best benefits of using MIDI. It allows you to free up your hands, which is really, really cool, because we only have two hands, but we have these many machines or more. It's a great way to kind of become an octopus. Nah, that makes no sense. That makes no sense. So you can be working like you have 100 hands, which is an amazing, amazing, amazing thing to do. So that's a great example of sending MIDI note information from Ableton to a synth like we just did with the bass line. But what if I want to send note information from an actual hardware instrument into the computer? So a lot of us use VSTs, and when you're using VSTs, you either have a MIDI controller, which of course we all know what that is now, or you can put in notes like we just did for the bass line. But what if I want to have the sub-fatty play a VST within Ableton? So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to send the MIDI out information and let Ableton decide where it's going to go as an input within Ableton. So if you look here, I have a VST open in Ableton called the Enough Chord Pad, which is just a stock instrument that comes with Ableton. So I can do it the old-fashioned way. If I didn't have a MIDI keyboard, I can use just a draw tool and pencil in exactly the notes that I want it to play. Or what I could do is I can actually use a sub-fatty now to control it. Similar to what we did before with the MIDI from all ins, keeping that on allows any signal to go into Ableton and go to what we're doing. So now, if I were to play the sub-fatty, it's going to control the VST. And it's all because I have all ins. So now that I have the sub-fatty controlling the VST in Ableton, yeah, I can play it, which is super cool. But what if I want to record these MIDI notes in Ableton so that it can keep looping and I can decide, oh, if I want to change a note, how do I do that? So pretty much what you're going to do is you're going to click on the record, and we're going to get this moving, just like an audio track. But don't forget, MIDI doesn't record audio, it records note information. So now if I play a chord on the sub-fatty, the MIDI notes are going to get recorded within Ableton. So now if you look here on our piano roll, instead of drawing it in, I actually played it with my hands and it's popping up here. And I can choose, oh, you know what, I want this C to be another note. And you can move it around because it's just MIDI information, which is super cool. You unclick fold, and then you just move it around how you like. And if you're thinking in your head, what does fold do? Fold just kind of condenses the view. So if you see here, you have all the notes in between that I'm playing. If I click fold, you're just seeing the notes that are being played. Very useful if you have a small screen. Now, not only are we able to send note information into Ableton, we could do something called control messages. And what that is, it's exactly the opposite. It's not notes, it's using MIDI to send other information. Now, how do we set that up? We're not gonna be using track anymore because that's just for notes. So we gotta go back into our live preferences and figure out what we're gonna set up. So as I mentioned before, we got track, sync, and remote. If you're thinking, why is it called remote? Well, think about unlocking a car. You can physically go and put the key in and turn it, or you can have a button and press it and unlocks it at a distance. So what we're doing with remote is we're telling Ableton to take MIDI information that's not notes and do something else that I don't have to physically touch Ableton to do it. So if that sounds a bit confusing, I'll show you what I mean. So doing exactly like we did with track, we gotta turn it on. And what we're gonna be doing is using the sub-fatty. So I'm turning remote in, on. And why is it in? Is because this is going to be an input into Ableton, which is our brain. If I close this and I turn a knob, nothing's really happening. But if you look in the top right of Ableton, next to the D, you're going to see that a light's appearing. And you're thinking, okay, what does that do? That allows me now to take any of these knobs using MIDI to control something in Ableton. And what's really cool about that is that you can send it at the same time as note information, so I can actually have now this knob control a parameter in my VST. So if I'm playing the VST again, and I want to control the cutoff like this, it's kind of annoying to have to use my mouse and touch it and go like that. Too bad I can't play it like a real synth. Well, guess what? MIDI, you can actually do that. And it's super simple to do in Ableton. I'm going to click in the top right this MIDI parameter. And when you click it, you're going to see certain things highlighted blue. And what that is, it's Ableton telling you this is what you're allowed to actually use as a remote. So what I want to do is I want to use the filter cutoff. So I'm going to click it, and all you need to do to assign something is touch what you want to assign it to. So I'm going to hit the cutoff because it's a cutoff of the synth and it's a cutoff of that. I touch it, it's going to pop up here under MIDI mappings, and I'm going to see the control over here. So if I take off the MIDI assign button, go back to a regular thing, and I play a chord, and I touch this knob, guess what? It's going to be controlling the cutoff, which is super useful. If I want to go more crazy, I can by controlling the filter res with the resonance knob here. So now that I mapped the cutoff and I just mapped the resonance, now I have more control over the VST without even looking at Ableton. So now I'm just touching the cutoff and touching the resonance. And this is an example of what remote is. Now I'm sending information that's MIDI, but not notes. It's actually control messages as what we call CC messages in MIDI. And then what's super cool about that is, remember how I showed you before I was playing the keys and recording it? I can actually record the keys, and also I can record the information of me sweeping the cutoff. So I'll show you an example. And if I do this. So now that I recorded those notes, I also recorded the filter sweep because that's also MIDI information that could be recorded in Ableton. So let's hear how that sounds. Beautiful. It's there. I don't have to worry about that. And this is what I was talking about, that MIDI actually allows you to have multiple hands. So technically, while that's going, I can control the resonance at the same time. So now we talked about what track and remote do in MIDI settings in Ableton. The one thing we didn't talk about yet was sync. And as you can imagine, sync has something to do with the tempo. What's really great about MIDI is that, again, it doesn't only send note information, it doesn't only send control information, it also sends clock information. As you can tell, all these DAWs that you use, you always have to set the clock, which is the BPM. When you have an old drum machine like this, for example, and I want it to be in time with Ableton, I gotta have the clocks synced to each other. So now with the 909, if I hit start, the internal clock is syncing the machine. But what if I want Ableton to sync this? This is where we're gonna use sync. Click on live, we go to preferences, and we're gonna go back to our MIDI settings, and we're gonna see sync is off for all the channels. So it's kind of the similar thing that we did for remote and also for track. So we gotta tell Ableton where is the MIDI information going. And in this case, we want Ableton to send sync information to the 909. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to sync, we're gonna go to output, and I'm gonna go to port B because the 909 is hooked up to port B on my MIDI box. I'm gonna turn sync on for port B of the output. Now when I close it and hit play, guess what? it's synced. Now if I press play again, you're gonna see that the tempo no longer does anything. But the tempo now is gonna be controlled in Ableton. And this is really helpful because not only can I control all these parameters on the 909, like so, it allows this now to be fully synced in what's going on in Ableton, which is really, really useful. Now, the reason why I like to use it with the 909, for example, is that I have access to this. Of course, I can use samples, but for me, it's more fun that I can actually have it playing and I can actually control the knobs live and I can jam like that, which I really like to do because I love changing parameters and tweaking things. But that's just my way. Sync can actually be used in so many ways, like I mentioned before. So it's really up to you, just like everything else with MIDI. It gives you the freedom to control everything you want. In this video, I showed you just a very basic overview of what MIDI can do, and we actually did quite a lot within Ableton, so you can only imagine how much more you can do. And that's what's really cool about it, is that I have it set up a certain way here, but when you do it at home in your studio, you can set it up a million different ways that works best to your workflow. This is why we've been using it for 40 years. Interesting enough, MIDI 2.0 is actually being developed right now, which is going to take the existing MIDI protocols that we have and we use today and just make them a little bit better, a little bit faster, and a little bit more modern. Will it change much? Of course. Is it going to change how MIDI works completely? Absolutely not. The workflow is still going to stay intact, and this is why it's so useful in a studio. If it's your first time using MIDI and you're setting it up in your studio after this video, I'm really curious to see how you're setting it up, so write it in the comments. If you're a MIDI expert and you have a better idea how to set things up or a really cool way of doing it, write it in the comments too, because I'm always looking for a new way to make my MIDI situation a lot better in my studio, because as you can tell, MIDI is endless and we can do so much with it. Like and subscribe if you want to see weekly videos like this, because I'm going to be doing them again. I love nerding out, so if you want to keep watching them, like and subscribe. Musical instrument digital interface. It sounds weird. Does it not sound weird? Am I crazy?
It's a little janky.
Musical instrument digital interface.